All right, welcome to a naive conversation in philosophy. We have our two guests here, including me. So I'm Rohan Rao. I'm in the class for existential physics, and we also have Eric Xie and Collin Lawrence. So I'll give them a couple of seconds to introduce themselves and their
Okay.
interests, background.
Hi, my name is Eric Xie. I'm a longtime friend of Rohan. I'm a economics and political science major, but I also enjoy reading and consuming media about philosophy in my free time.
I'm Collin Lawrence. I'm a computer science major and a history minor, and I don't have as much knowledge about philosophy, but I am excited to learn about it today.
Well, the thing about philosophy is a lot of it's kind of like ingrained in history, right?
That
So
is true, yeah. There's
yeah,
different, yeah, history is kind of based on different philosophies, so
mhm.
I guess that is true.
Right, that sounds great. So we will start with a pretty fundamental question that I think is going to guide this entire presentation, which is what is consciousness? So we have here the several questions related to consciousness. Okay, wait, hold on.
Let's pause it.
So we have something that's quite fundamental to our PowerPoint, which is, or to our whole presentation, which is the question of what exactly is consciousness. Consciousness is the word that a lot of people talk about, but okay, so what is consciousness? A lot of people throw around the word consciousness, but it's kind of like it's kind of a very abstract concept, right? So I think it's important to address like these following questions, like what is consciousness? How can it be, how is it measured? Can it be replicated? And isn't it like fundamentally scientific, right? So a lot of people, so I'm just curious, what do you guys think about the definition of consciousness?
I usually think of consciousness in like the Freudian sense, right? In which Freud devised, or I guess was one of the first to make the division between our active conscious and our subconscious, in which we have an active conscious that readily and willfully determines how we act and how we behave, and we have a subsequent subconscious where a lot of more passive stimuli are um, presumably just rendered as experience and therefore involuntarily influence our own actions. That's how I think about consciousness.
Colin?
Yeah, I think I don't really have a good definition because I think it's pretty hard to describe like what is consciousness, kind of like what you're saying with the limits, like what defines consciousness. So I think it's hard for me to come up with my own definition because I think like no one really knows definitively. So I think personally I don't really have a good definition I could give.
And yeah, that's kind of the point. A lot of people talk about consciousness in both books, kind of talk about consciousness, but I think it's kind of in both like books and in a lot of like conversations about like existential physics, the kind of definition of consciousness is given. One of the interesting interpretations that I came up with is not really what is consciousness per se, but how it's measured. So in the book, they talk about the concept of panpsychism, which is the belief or like dogma in it where like everything in existence or everything in the universe has some kind of level of consciousness.
Mm,
So let's say like this napkin can be conscious on some level, or like
okay.
I know you can't see the napkin, but this table can be consciousness on some level. And I think that kind of plays into more into how we can define consciousness in a way, because we think of it's kind of difficult to set a boundary what is conscious and what is not, right? We see a human and like obviously they're conscious, but are animals conscious in the same way? I mean, we can say they're conscious, but we don't know if
Mhm.
like they're conscious in the same way as a human, right? And it's kind of ridiculous to see like to call a table conscious. So I was thinking, what do you guys think about panpsychism?
So panpsychism, I think, distinctly relates to Leibniz's notion of monism. And what Leibniz essentially says is that there is a singular, irreducible substance that constitutes everything that exists and will potentially exist, and such that everything is constituted of these monads. And because we are just collections of these monads, the sort of implication of panpsychism, as you described it, could apply, in which um because humans are constituted in such a manner, our organization of monads are in such a manner that we produce such a consciousness, typically unconscious, or as we perceive to be unconscious things, such as the table that we're at right now, could have, to some degree, possess this consciousness. So I don't know if I completely buy into this depiction of consciousness, but I would not be opposed to believing that there is some sort of irreducible essence that is shared between both conscious and what we deem as unconscious beings.
Yeah, I think that it's not unreasonable because, like you were saying, like you can't really define consciousness, so it's kind of hard to disprove that everything doesn't have a conscious, right? So I think that it is definitely possible since we don't know like the limits or extent of consciousness.
My personal interpretation after like reading about panpsychism is that if we can define, let's say this is from a very analytical perspective, because I'm a STEM major, so I
Yeah.
kind of think this way. But from like an analytical perspective, if we do think of consciousness not as being binary, as like you're either conscious or not, we can think of consciousness as like as a continuous scale, right? Like for example, like this table here is like has a consciousness like I don't know like 0.1, where like I have consciousness like 100.
Okay.
So like it's a very arbitrary kind of style. It's a very arbitrary kind of unit of measure.
Yeah.
But I think that fundamentally, if we do define consciousness in this way, and there have been like other like scientists who have talked about this, but if we do define consciousness in this way, perhaps consciousness can be a measurement of the complexity of a system.
Okay.
Right. So systems that are more complex in a way are capable of consciousness, but that would imply that like entire ecosystems in the universe as a whole is capable of conscious thought.
I think the issue that I take with that explanation would be that although one could create a sort of index of consciousness, a spectrum of consciousness between items that we deem as consciousness, there is ultimately what I tend to believe in, there is a sort of conscious essence that some objects will have and some objects don't. So although we can measure like the spectrum of consciousness between like a squirrel and a human being, there might be an essence shared between us animals that is not possessed by the table before us. I would, this is highly abstract, and this essence is would be very much a spiritual and intangible sort of conception, probably beyond the measures of science to measure. But I would almost think that the dignity and worth and value of like conscious beings and human beings in particular would be diminished if we were to treat everything along this type of spectrum. Maybe this is egotistical, but that's what I believe.
Yeah, I think I kind of agree with what you were saying, where like it kind of falls apart at like a larger scale, like universes and galaxies. And then like I don't know how complex like supercomputers get, but there might be like a supercomputer more complex than like a brain of like a minnow or something. And like, does that mean it has greater consciousness than a minnow? Like, I think some would probably disagree, or most would disagree.
So, Colin, you think that consciousness is something that's relegated to like biology or like biological systems, or can like non-organic things also have consciousness?
I think that non-organic can, like I said, like there's no really. I think we're trying to define a system, right? So there's no scale. So if we're kind of operating with no scale, then I think you have to accept the fact that non like biological things could have consciousnesses. But yeah, so if we're trying to set the scale, we need to include non-biological. So
maybe one can think of the conscious essence as not a degree of complexity, but rather a format of biological organization of a given substance that is unique and that does segregate between the conscious and between the organic and non-inorganic, or not even that, between the ultimately, I hate to be like redundant, but between the conscious and the unconscious, because ultimately we will not treat an amoeba the same way as we would treat a human being, but there may be a philosophical argument about consciousness that could apply when contrasting between an amoeba versus a pebble, for instance. One one could treat a certain mineral as a lot more technically complex than an amoeba, but there is ultimately some sort of self-actualizing mechanism within an amoeba that makes it fundamentally unique and separate from the inorganic and unbiological. So
But what would you think of like a ecological like system with like multiple organisms like in it? Like would you like classify like a rainforest as more complex than like an amoeba or something?
that is an interesting question. Maybe there is, I don't know if the simple collection of biological systems by itself would thereby constitute some sort of biological being. But a lot of people, including Descartes, famously attributed a certain spiritual. I believe it was Descartes. It was either Descartes or Spinoza, but attributed a certain spirituality to nature that is similar, if not the same, to God. So maybe there is some sort of conscious essence possessed by nature that might be imperceptible to us because we're only constituents of it and we're not outside observers of it. But I'm certainly open to such ideas and conceptions.
I think it's interesting that both of you kind of converged on the topic of like biology and how that can be like the starting point of where we define things to be conscious. One of the authors of the book that we were reading, Sabrina Hassenfeld, I don't know if you're familiar with her. She does a lot of she like does a lot of like scientific like education stuff on YouTube, and like she's also a physicist. But I feel like I should have mentioned that first. But she stated that if we are going to use a continuous scale for consciousness, there has to be a point where we just say, okay, this is complete, like this is not conscious, right?
Okay.
And then we have to be a point where we like start to like consider things to be capable of like inhibiting consciousness and some inhibiting, is that the right word? Anyway.
Yeah.
So
Like portraying consciousness on like some kind of way. So if we are talking about biology, something that I did bring up or something that I did think of is that the most fundamental like particle that we can think of as being biological
okay.
is RNA because of its capability to replicate, to self-replicate. But there are also like prokaryotes and amoebas, as you mentioned, which we don't know if we can really classify them as consciousness on the or like put them even on the same spectrum as humans.
I certainly agree with you that there must be a lower threshold that should be established to delineate between the conscious and the unconscious. But this also begs the question of whether or not a higher threshold also exists. For example, perhaps there is some sort of super consciousness inaccessible to us, but could still feasibly exist beyond our own comprehension that might embody the characteristics of consciousness more comprehensively than what we have right now. This is a question that I don't think anybody can answer, but as related to perhaps a consciousness embodied by a supercomputer, in what way could that sort of consciousness surpass what we have, and how would our own definition of consciousness have to adapt in order to incorporate such a higher threshold? Does such a higher threshold exist if we just categorize something as consciousness? Does further categorization within that topic become meaningless and redundant? I don't know, but it is open to, I guess when you open consciousness to such a spectrum, it is very difficult to control how far this analysis proceeds.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting when you brought up like RNA, because if RNA has a consciousness, then it's kind of the same like kind of like how ecological systems, right, consist of animals, like we consist of like RNA and like cells and stuff. So like if each individual cell has consciousness, then like how does that make up our greater consciousness? Or like if like a squirrel has a consciousness, how does that make up the greater consciousness of that like ecological system?
Perhaps could a accumulation of subconsciouses coalesce into a consciousness that we possess? I don't know.
That is interesting because we are made of cells. We are we like to think of like biological living beings as like a singular object, but they're ultimately a system composed of many different kinds of objects.
Yeah.
Many of them being cells and like and like maybe there's a whole topic of like if you remove a brain from its body and you keep it in like a vat, and if it's able to think, is that like is that, are you really just your brain, or are you like your brain and all the parts that compose it? There's like a philosophical like thought experiment that was like a Greek, like
Yeah.
a ship. If you take all the part of it, a ship,
Ship
the
Theseus,
ship of
yeah.
Theseus, yes.
That is I guess if we think about a disembodied brain, rationalists like Descartes would probably answer yes, that is all there is to consciousness. Even if you're not experiencing external stimuli, you're still capable of exercising some element of deduction and induction such that your consciousness would be, one can say, maybe not fully complete, but fully active. Um, this is only like one half of the sort of debate on this sort of topic, but I might be compelled to agree with the rationalist in that sense.
Yeah, I think that the brain argument's interesting because like if like certain aspects of or certain functions of the brain might just be what creates a consciousness, right? Like being able to react to stimuli and being able to kind of react to your environment, right? So that can also help with the biological element, which describes like animals and like humans having consciousness because they have those particular parts of the brain, right? But I don't know a lot about the anatomy of a brain, so I don't know if that holds up across the animal kingdom or not, but
I
that
think
could be possible.
I think I should also add that there are some who do say that one cannot, most famously Kant, who said this, that one cannot possess and commence a consciousness without a certain degree of stimulation external to ourselves. In other words, if you were just purely a newly born brain, that brain would not develop a consciousness if it did not experience some sort of external stimuli. Um, this is why Kant is often thought of as seeking a compromise between rationalism and empiricism. Um, that might be a more complete analysis on how consciousness actually operates, but I don't necessarily. But then that begs the question: if you already had such a consciousness developed and then you disembodied it, could that consciousness persist? I don't know.
Yeah.
So I do want to get on to like the next two questions because we're still kind of like, I think so. Colin mentioned that building a supercomputer that can potentially like recreate like intelligence, and there is not like artificial intelligence or like consciousness on a certain level and like self-awareness. So I think as someone who has like worked with AI quite a bit and like has like a decent understanding of neural networks, I think that our current implementation of neural networks is loosely based on the brain. And it's of course limited at this point in time, but fundamentally what it breaks down to is solving an optimization problem where we have, let's say, an error function that we want to like reduce. And we just continually like perform like derivatives and like calculus operations in order to like make sure that we get our error function to the lowest it could possibly be. So in that sense, that is purely completely algorithmic. So at one point, and I think this kind of relates to the whole argument of whether we can describe like amoebas and bacteria as being like conscious. At what point do we separate something that's purely algorithmic in like thought process and like seeking out food and stuff? And what point does something become conscious? Because is our thought process can or like entire thought process and perception of the world can be based on like algorithms that are just extremely complex.
Yeah, I think kind of like we were saying with the brain, like how it inputs or you input stimuli and then it like outputs like thought. I think if a computer can get like inputted a completely new piece of information and then like using the information that it has kind of create like a somewhat intelligent response, I think that's kind of getting there. If we're using the definition of consciousness as like a brain reacting to stimuli, right? Because then it's kind of reacting to the information it gets and then has a response to it.
I get, you have to question the age-old like empiricist question, like to what extent is our own psychological progressions ultimately algorithmic. Something could be said in noting that as opposed to artificial intelligence, there is a spontaneous essence within human consciousnesses that are fundamentally distinct from any sort of artificially generated intelligence. What this spontaneity is, I do not know. You could label it as free will. You could label it as just sort of potentially involuntary like spasms in this sort of almost schizophrenic sense. I don't. So I'm at least from our own sort of like dignified standpoint, it's not very comfortable a position to assume in just saying that we are essentially algorithmic beings that intake a sensation and output a decision. So I would doubt that because I have faith in this sort of spontaneity, I doubt a consciousness of our sort of nature could be faithfully replicated elsewhere.
Okay, that's good. That's good because we are going to be talking about like the spontaneity and stuff
Mhm.
when it comes to like quantum probability, not like later on in this presentation. But I do want to end off the slide with talking about do you think consciousness is a scientific idea or not? Personally, I don't think it is. Just because I'm like more or less like a if you can't define something, if there's like conflicting definitions of what you're measuring of your dependent variable per se, I think that it's kind of difficult to label that as scientific. Now, I do want to believe that there is something beyond just the algorithmic nature of our brain that allows us to like be different from even like the most complex artificial intelligences that we can produce. But I'm curious, do you guys think that like consciousness in itself is a scientific concept, or is it kind of like relegated to metaphysics?
I think that it could be, like you were saying with the different scales, like I think there is going to be some sort of measurement of consciousness, like on some sort of level, based on like complexity or like input with stimuli and stuff. But I think that it's definitely debatable, right? It's not a clear cut, yes, it is scientific, because it's still pretty unknown concept, even like now, right, with all our scientific advancements and stuff. So I think that as of now, I think that almost like everything kind of is scientific, so I'm leaning towards yes. But yeah, I don't know. I think that I would go with yes, just like because there is some way to measure it, and like even though it might not be uniform, there's just like you can get data from it.
I think I would ardently disagree with the sort of like positivist framework that you're describing this question in. I think ultimately just because you cannot provide like a Procrustean scientific method to evaluate consciousness does not mean that there aren't certain scientific aspects of consciousness, but ultimately I don't it doesn't mean that you cannot encapsulate consciousness into or define it within scientific terms. It would be a difficult endeavor, but it doesn't mean that this endeavor has not already been approached. I mean, we have a whole branch of psychology that deals with this sort of question, right? Uh, it's even if we cannot understand the origin and the let me say it like this. Although the only truly unknown thing about consciousness, at least in my opinion, is the origin. We don't really understand how a consciousness originates. We have an incomplete picture of the nature of consciousness, but we really don't know how consciousness originates, right? That's the fundamental question, the $1 million question. Even if that question is totally inaccessible to science, I would be skeptical to then infer that it is a failure of science or beyond science to answer that question. But ultimately, is it just simply beyond our own consciousness in a way? It seems tautological, but is it ultimately beyond our own consciousness to answer this question? Perhaps there is some other method, some other sort of being that could provide insight to how it originates, but it might not just be us.
Yes. So that's all. You actually introduced quite a few points that we're going to be talking about in this presentation, including like talking about a being that can potentially be able to observe how the mind thinks objectively and like talk about consciousness through like meditation. Yeah, and also like what you said about the difficulty in introspectively analyzing our own mind to the extent to which we can figure out the origin of consciousness. So, and that's actually something that I know you mentioned Kant a lot. It's actually also something that Kant has objected to, our ability to like introspectively think that way. So we'll move on to the next slide here. All right, so we'll move on to the next slide now. No. All right, so let's talk about free will because I think it was mentioned in the previous slide. So the topic of this is that consciousness is purely the result of physical processes that occur in the brain and is ultimately predictable. So in one of our books, they do talk about from Sabrina Hossenfelder, the physicist, who believes that the fundamental truth that we have discovered through empiricism is that everything is only in nothing less and nothing more than the sum of its parts, which includes humans. So if we can explain the interactions between like neurons, for instance, we're saying that consciousness is only relegated to the brain. If we can explain the interaction between neurons and like the atoms within those neurons and like the quantum particles within the neurons, it's just going to be a matter of stacking equations in like physical models on top of each other until we can say that, oh, like me like talking about this, me making the decision to like pick up this piece of paper, for example, is completely predictable. So this ultimately falls down into the topic of determinism, and whether because of the existence of determinism is free will truly real. So we can start off with that. So what do you guys think about this question? I know it's a tough
yeah, it
thing
is
to
a tough
swallow.
question. Yeah, I don't know like a lot about like kind of what you're saying, like the complexity and like being able to understand free will in that way. I guess from like more of my religious background, it's a little weirder because they kind of describe it as like that we have free will, but it's also that like God is like all knowing, so that he like in theory should know what everyone's gonna do. That kind of gets rid of free will. So it's kind of like a iffy topic, like even in the church. So yeah, I don't really know how to kind of even begin to describe it, because I think there's just, it's kind of also like consciousness, like it's kind of embedded in consciousness in a way where it's just such a complex thing that it's like really is hard to define.
I would think that even in the, you mentioned the sort of religious context for this question, and this sort of immediately, at least in my view, introduces the work of like Kierkegaard and his evaluation of like the story of Abraham. There are certain, at least in Kierkegaard's mind, one believes in God for no reason at all, right? One believes in God for the sake of just a belief in God. And that, at least to me, seems like a choice that is fundamentally bereft of any sort of influence within our own material conditions. So if you quantified perfectly the material conditions surrounding us or the neurological processes within us, even such a sort of absurd decision might not even be able to be modeled. Perhaps I'm wrong, but I would like to think that there are certain decisions made by us that are totally within the purview of rationality. This doesn't preclude like whatever quantifiable modeling could exist for our brains, but ultimately, if free will were to just like not exist at all, I would think that there would the ultimate sense of dignity that we have might not exist or just commence its existence at all. It's almost as if consciousness has to accommodate to a certain degree of free will, at least in my view. But I don't think I elaborated on that notion well, but I think that's might be the best summation of what I think. That the two are necessarily present with each other. They cannot be separated.
Yeah, I agree with that, that they can't be separated.
Sorry, can you specify what can't be separated?
As in, you cannot have a consciousness without a degree of free will.
Yes.
And you can't have free will without consciousness.
Yeah, that's the main thing. So we will discuss later how like consciousness and free will are related in like in a quantum, how like quantum like physics or our current understanding of quantum physics and like quantum probability kind of ties them two together. But in the last slide we did mention about like the algorithmic nature of the brain. So I do have a quote from the book that I thought was particularly impactful, at least for like for my like base, which I like was able to like apply my understanding of computer science to, which is our brains perform computations on input following equations that act on an initial state. Whether these computations are algorithmic is an open question we'll come to later, but there's no magic juice in our neocortex that puts us above the laws of nature. So it does say if it's algorithmic or not. That's up to like interpretation, but or that's open to questioning. But fundamentally, the processes that guide our thought are based in physics, unless there's a what is the aspect of that is not like based in physics, that's based in like something outside of physics. And I think there is a thought of called like a school of thought called like dualism, which allows for the existence of consciousness being ascientific and like scientific processes that are happening in our mind, and it's about two separate things that don't have to necessarily conflict with each other. So do you guys believe that consciousness can exist independently of the physical reality that we exist in? I know these are very tough questions, but
Can consciousness exist separately from our physical reality? I am inclined to say no, because it might just be the case that, as again, free will must coexist and be co-eval with consciousness, that the intangible and tangible aspects of consciousness must exist with each other. One can almost think of it as if there's a sort of like algorithmic description one can impose upon how we derive a certain sensation. Like, for example, there might be an algorithmic explanation for why I feel hungry at a certain stage. There might be an intangible explanation for why I decide not to act on that sensation, or why I decide to act for that sensation. In either cases, the sensation still exists, but the decision may be criterionless with respect to scientific explanation. That could be a proper summation of how we act, or it could be totally absent of any sort of like actual bearing into reality. I don't know, but
Well, I think kind of what you were
Sure.
saying, like deciding to eat or not, right? I think that also can have some sort of like computational like elements to it, right? Like you can weigh the risk of you like, oh, I actually need to finish this right now, or I need to I actually don't have anything for the next half an hour, so I might as well eat now. So I think there is some inherent like computations like going on, like even in like those kind of like spur of the moment decisions, or kind of more seeming like inconsequential decisions.
yeah, again, kind of injecting like AI into this in like our understanding of like neural networks. There's a possibility, that a very pessimistic possibility, that we are just solving a really big calculus equation, a calculus optimization problem, where perhaps there is some kind of quantifiable way. Perhaps there's a way to like quantify like happiness, or a way to quantify like well-being, that we're trying to constantly optimize in our brain, like utilitarian, like optimize utilitarianism. So perhaps we make decisions based on what's going to maximize our like utilitarianist equation in our mind, which is a very pessimistic view, at least in my opinion, because it kind of just completely denies the existence of consciousness and say that we're purely computational beings.
Yeah, I don't know if like that's like I necessarily agree with that, because you don't like do everything that you want to do all the time, right? Like there is some stuff where you're like oh, I have to like go to class today, right? And like you still like go, even though it might feel better for your brain to like sleep in, or like just like watch something on TV instead, right? So I think there is some element of doing stuff that doesn't always bring
I guess one could think of those contingencies as just bounds or alterations to the sort of calculus in our brains, such that given those conditions, what does the calculation render as a result? This is tough. I I'm inclined to be very hostile towards this sort of pessimism. I would like to think that even if we maybe largely involuntarily conduct this sort of optimization process, right? And then all of our actions are consequences of this optimization. This to me is a very convenient explanation for how we decide what to do and how to behave. Don't I don't know. This seems more of a heuristic than an actual explanation of our actions. So I am very reluctant to place any sort of like bearing to that to this sort of proposition that you just gave us. But it's tough.
I mean, that makes sense. I agree with you on some level, because obviously it's kind of hard to really, it does sound more like a heuristic, because it's kind of hard to even conceptualize a way to quantify happiness. Like, what are we even trying to like quantify here? What are we even trying to maximize in like our life, right? Is that going to be like happy for some people it would be happiness, for some people it might be like well-being, but I don't think that, I think that there's too much variety in humans and their like ambitions, that we can just say that, oh, evolutionary, all people are just programmed to optimize for this one like value, like this arbitrary value. So I agree with that, in the sense that I don't think it is purely mathematical. So I think in the last slide we also just discussed. Is there anyone else want to talk about this a bit further, or?
I guess there might be like, it might not be one set value, right? Like everyone can like prioritize different things, but I guess then it begs the question is like, how does the person choose the thing that to prioritize, right? So then I guess maybe that can also be input of like different stimuli and different like things that they've heard, right? Like if someone hears like, oh yeah, like money is all you need, like, right, that's all you need from like everyone, they're probably gonna do everything to optimize like getting more money or something, right? Or they like ignore the advice and they just like hate the person who said that, and then they do like the opposite, like try to go for like another method or something, right? So I think I'm kind of agreeing with you a little bit on the big like calculus of it, because I think there is some sort of math to like what like each decision, right? But I think you're right, it's a very complex problem. So I think that's also why AI hasn't gotten there yet, because we don't have the ability to put in as much stimuli and like parameters to like what they want to get to kind of create conscious AI, right? So yeah.
Okay, so I want to talk about something that was stated earlier about like the perhaps like theorized existence of randomness and how that can impact consciousness. So are you familiar with the mathematician Roger Penrose?
I've heard of it.
So Roger Penrose is a very popular mathematician who has done a lot of like important math. I think he got his Nobel or Fields Medal recently, which is like the highest recognition in mathematics. So something that he's been working on is trying to figure out if like he's been tackling this consciousness problem and saying like in strongly, or at least someone believes that that like consciousness and like human behavior is not completely deterministic, and there is some quantum fluctuation, like quantum fluctuations can like impact human behavior. And I think, is everyone like kind of up to date? I'm not up to date with quantum physics. Is everyone like familiar with like the wave function
Uncertainty, like
uncertainty
the
principle?
quantum physics sense of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
yeah, generally, yeah.
we are unable to like predict the positioning of a particle given its momentum. We're unable to predict the momentum of a particle given its position. So there is a fundamental part of physics that we are unable at this current point in time, unable to like quantify, model, that kind of stuff. So here we have microtubules in the brain, and what Roger Penrose's research is trying to show is that quantum effects can impact. Essentially, if you do observe like quantum, or if you do observe these microtubules in like neuron cells, they do tend to like collapse and show quantum behavior. So is there a possibility that the randomness of quantum phenomena can impact consciousness and allow us to like kind of break away from the deterministic like view of the world? Or
Yeah, I think there can be some randomness. Like that can also be used to like describe like why certain people like focus on different things, right? But it also can be like for like the smaller decisions. Like it could just be like 67% chance you're going to do this thing, or 33 you're going to do this, or like a 50-50, right? Like depending on the scenario. So it could like ultimately it could be there could be some element of randomness in decisions we make. Because like sometimes, yeah, like it feels like spontaneous. It's like, okay, I'm just gonna do like you can kind of just make a split-second decision, but that could actually just be like a 50-50 that you made like in your brain, right? So yeah, I think there is definitely some element of randomness for this.
I think I think of uncertainty in this respect in a slightly different manner, right? So even if one were to completely operationalize and quantify the processes in the brain, right? And ascribe a certain degree of spontaneity to our own behavior, I think there's a certain sense of uncertainty that can extend beyond just behavior. And this is actually probably one of the reasons why, like, I don't really consider myself to be an atheist anymore, like pure atheist. But ultimately, like, yes, there might be a certain degree of like quantum uncertainty in our decisions, but how does one explain the uncertainty of being born in your own body, right? That's not behavior, that's not action, that's just reality. There perhaps might be an arbitrary reason why Eric Xie, was born into Eric Xie's body instead of being born as Collin Lawrence. And maybe this sensation could be operationalized, but I don't really think so. I feel like just because there is a personal element to consciousness and that we are personally experiencing consciousness, there has to be, in my view, something metaphysical that exists. So I can completely accept this sort of uncertainty argument that's being provided by quantum physics, but still ascribe some uncertainty outside of its realm.
I actually agree, because one of the reasons why I think, there is, I think a lot of people and a lot of people in the scientific community who do completely just deny like religion. I think it's interesting you brought up like why you're not a pure atheist, but I think a lot of people who in the scientific community who just like completely reject like any kind of possibility of God existing is that it kind of assumes that our senses and our like ability to perceive reality is like truthful. Like reality is not more than what we see, than how we see it and perceive it consciously. And like perhaps like for a good example, like perhaps there are senses that we don't have that reality can be written in, or perhaps there are patterns that we're just incapable of perceiving biologically, but we don't know that because how would we know that there are patterns that we can't perceive? So I think that from our understanding, physics is only knowledge of the universe that we are capable of attaining. There are perhaps other aspects of the universe that we're just incapable of understanding, regardless of our instruments and our technology, because we just never thought of that level, or our mathematics is not capable of like modeling that, because there are potentially other mathematical systems out there that perhaps are better than ours. And like other civilizations in the universe might use that if you believe in aliens. It's a whole other thing. But I think that perhaps the metaphysics is kind of associated with like pseudoscience. Well, it is pseudoscience, but we can't just completely deject that. We have to consider the possibility that maybe we're not capable of like perceiving everything that's like there to see.
Okay. I don't know if I would label metaphysics as pseudoscience. I would just simply say metaphysics is not science, but that's another argument to have.
Okay.
Colin, you can start in your response.
I know I went kind of long. I can rephrase it.
Yeah, maybe rephrase it again, because I thought it was more of just an explanation rather than a question.
I'm just thinking, what do you guys think about the possibility that there are that the like that consciousness can exist outside of physics, and like because our understanding of physics is fundamentally limited by our ability to perceive reality, correct?
Yeah.
Like, do you think that we have our five senses, maybe six if you consider like heat a sense, but our senses are capable of like understanding everything in the universe?
Yeah. Well, I
There's a
think,
possibility that it's not.
yeah. I
And-
think I agree with you, but there is a possibility that it is not, right? Like, so we won't have, yeah, like consciousness and like free will and all this might be an unsolvable problem for us, right?
Mhm.
Because we can't get those the data and like that we need, right? So then we kind of have to rely on it as a kind of more outside of science type thing, just because it's impossible for us to figure it out. But yeah, we're not sure if we're like there yet, right? So I think that it's not fair to draw that conclusion now that it is outside of science. I think it'll always be hard to though, because you never know when you're at the limits of physics, right? So I think that if you just work under the assumption that you're not at the limits, then I think you just keep trying, right? Because then it kind of progresses physics in a way. So I think I'm more inclined to believe that like it's not outside the limits just to um be able to like push those limits further, but I like recognize the possibility that it is there might be some like 11th dimensional so fun that we can't can't conceive of.
Yeah, I would say that like just hypothetically, if our sensations were maximized and our technological development were maximized such that no future technological development could exist, there would, I think, in an infinite universe, there would necessarily have to be certain aspects of it that constitute reality and constitute physics that escape our own comprehension. Um, this I think it's relatively simple in that respect. Um, yeah, I don't think I have anything more to add in that aspect. There's always going to be a certain aspect of reality that is beyond our means to grasp.
Yeah.
And I think it's unfortunate that a lot of like the scientific community kind of puts full faith in their ability, in their empirical abilities. Science is right, and which is why they completely reject any kind of like potentially like religious beliefs, not potentially like religious beliefs, right? And I mean that's just a personal opinion. I know a lot of people who are very like staunchly like agnostic. Agnostic is the one that
They're ambivalent, they're
Yeah.
unsure, yeah.
ambivalent. I know a lot of people who are like agnostic, or a lot of people who are like completely like fully atheist, who kind of believe that our understanding of the science is an accurate description of the universe, and our senses are completely capable of
It can be accurate, but
accurate.
it could be, but it doesn't mean it's comprehensive.
Yeah, it is definitely
Yes.
limited.
Accurate, yeah, accuracy. It does do a very good job at modeling the universe.
Yeah.
Based on empiricism. All right, so we'll move on to the next slide. All right, so we'll talk about this part, which is called like choosing our path, which is a very interesting concept in the sense that perhaps there are several, whenever you make a decision, the many worlds interpretation, are you guys familiar with that? So whenever you make a decision, a new universe kind of pops up where there's one universe where you didn't make the decision, another universe where you didn't make the decision. But first I do want to talk about the double slit experiment. So in this experiment, like I think you both are familiar with it, at least like in a basic way.
Yeah.
There's a wave particle duality, and like observing if you don't observe the particle, it behaves like a wave. If you do observe the particle, it behaves like a
Other way
you do
around.
observe the
Yeah.
particle, it behaves like a wave.
Wave and the particle.
Right. Okay. You guys are familiar
Yeah,
with it. So I looked up online to see like if there's any explanations of this. What a lot of people think, which is kind of incorrect, is that the tools that we're using to measure the particle kind of cause it to like reduce, or the wave to reduce into a particle. But there have been studies that show that even after the fact, we see that if you measure the even like after the fact, if you measure the light wave after it passes through the slit, and then it still acts like a particle, which
So like even if you were to observe the or even if you were to observe the particle without any means of interfering with it
at the time.
tangibly at the time, it
Yes.
still behaves differently
It's still
because of the observation.
Yeah, so it's
Okay.
purely just on the observation. It's not the instruments itself. That's the main
Okay.
point I'm trying to make.
Yeah.
So a lot of people claim that consciousness causes this wave to collapse into a particle because of it being observed by a conscious observer, right? Because at the end of the day, even if it's after the fact, the last person who's going to be seeing this is a conscious being
Yeah.
who's capable of interpreting the data. So do you guys believe, I know this is kind of beyond
This is very interesting. Because this I think is somewhat analogous to a lot of the phenomenological questions being asked. Like there was I believe it was Heidegger who said that we shape reality around us through an act. I actually might have been Husserl who said we shape reality around us by directing some sort of intentionality onto our direct observances, such that by the mere conscious, willful act of observance, there's some sorts of some sort of psychological or philosophical, like conscious alteration being conducted. One might ask the question whether or not this change is purely a facet of our own conscious, or if it's an actual reality being being manifested. In other words, is our perception of reality an illusion, or like in this sense, is the observation of the double slit experiment just an illusion because we have directed our consciousness towards it? Um, I this seems like a possible answer or a possible interpretation that could exist. But the mechanisms behind it would be exceedingly difficult to explain. Um, but yeah, I don't know if like does this intentionality have some sort of substance? I doubt it does, but it would be interesting that even if it did not have a sort of material manifestation or like material explanation or tangible explanation, that there is some sort of material influence that could result from it. I would be inclined to say no, that there would not be a material consequence of it, and that thereby the sort of observation of the double slit experiment would just be an illusion to us and not an actual reality. Um, but that could be infeasible because of my own illiteracy on this topic, like literal illiteracy on like physics in this respect.
No, I haven't taken physics too in 2 years. So I mean, I don't call when you
I'm taking it now, but yeah, they didn't really go much into like they just kind of mentioned that, yeah, like when observed, it changes, right? And then at the double slit, it comes out as a wave, but when observed, it's like a particle, right? But I think that also just kind of shows the limits like of our senses, right? Like because like we can't fully trust like our senses, right? So there might be something there that we're like not seeing, or something that we just can't comprehend. So our brain just like, or our consciousness or brain, or like alters it in a way so it is comprehensible, right? So I think that also just like lends credence to the fact that like our senses are like fallible, how like there is going to be a limit to what we can understand based on our senses.
alters it in a way that is that is very
Mm.
that is very interesting.
Yeah.
Because I know like from a very basic perspective, for an example being like when we view images through our eyes, they're flipped, they're actually upside down, but
Inversed,
they're
yeah.
flipped, they're inversed in our brain does that. So our mind is capable of like altering reality so it is more comprehensible for us,
Yeah.
in perhaps for like an evolutionary benefit.
Almost as if like is the sort of wave particle paradox only a paradox because we as conscious beings have almost automatically applied an incorrect illusion to our own observations, such that maybe this paradox does not actually exist in real life, but it only exists in our own observation and our own perhaps incorrect observation. Um, Maybe science could answer that later on. I'm not sure. Maybe
Yeah.
not.
Yeah, because like it's impossible, like fundamentally impossible to see something that we like can't comprehend, right? Because there's always going to be something there. So I think that even if like that particle is something that we can't comprehend, we are just going to see something. So I think that it's like hard to trust our senses in that regard, especially because of the paradox.
That is interesting because I know there are I can't really name them now. I think it's like there's maybe the shepherd tone illusion where it's like a tone that plays that's like a downward, like it goes down forever, it seems. And like when people see it in conjunction with like a certain animation, it makes them feel like they're falling.
Oh yeah.
I think the existence of illusions kind of shows that our brains do try to like make sense of reality, and it can perhaps like bias our understanding of the universe. I think what was interesting about this, and this is maybe because I'm kind of I play too many video games. I used to. When I first heard about consciousness kind of influencing reality in this way, I kind of thought about how if you ever play a first-person shooter, if you ever play a first-person shooter with a really bad computer, if you look in one direction, you see pop-ins. You see reality kind of popping in. If you look in another direction, you see it kind of disappears behind you as like as a way to like improve efficiency. You don't want to render things you can't see, right? So you only render things that you're looking at. So, and there's also kind of I don't know, are you guys familiar with the Boltzmann brain?
No.
Okay, I don't want to bring that up.
This sounds like phenomenalism, which like the objects that we are not observing simply do not exist, and the objects that we are observing are the only things that exist, sort
Like
of.
object permanence type thing, like how like dogs
Kind
don't have object permanence, or like babies really like can't see stuff, or they don't like the things outside their peripheral, like they don't believe exists or something.
Yeah, well, not exactly object permanence even, because what I'm saying is even more extreme, where, and perhaps it is like solipsism, related to solipsism in a way, where you are the main character of the universe. But whatever you see is the only thing that exists. You create reality through consciousness. Which I think is a very kind of terrifying thought.
Yeah, solipsism is a very dangerous path to choose, and quite apropos to the slide. I would think that even if just because we must possess a certain personal perspective in our own consciousness, right? This does not, I don't think there is any sort of logical conclusion that could be made from that there is nothing pertinent outside of us, or there's nothing existent, nothing extant outside of that. I don't think that's a necessary conclusion. I would. This is very, yeah, very difficult subject. I don't know if I think this probably relates to just the previous general question on like the limits of human perception. I don't think you could. I don't think human perception ought to be bounded based on based on personal perception. I think personal perception is just somewhat irrelevant to the question of sensation in general. So that's my rather simplistic response to your commentary.
That wasn't very simplistic.
Yeah, like I lost a little bit.
All right, Colin, what do you what do you think about this? The world doesn't exist. What do you think about it?
I don't know. I think it's hard. Like, I think there is some like fundamental like truths to kind of like what we perceive, right? I mean, like since we all perceive the same thing, like the table looks the same to like all of us in some regard, like maybe there's like a different shading or like some difference between like our vision and the table. It's like fundamentally or like almost like basically the same, right? So I think there is like reality is not only made by consciousness, because then other people like are interacting with the same thing but have different ideals of like what it was. But it is also weird how we can have like the different like seeing the particle as a wave or a wave as a particle thing, right? Like we'll all share that, like all humans, like not one person can like see it. So there is a possibility that we're all constructing the same reality just through the brains. But I think that's also would be much harder to prove, because like there would be a person who like just based on like some mutation that would be able to like see something else, right? Like they wouldn't like be in the same sort of reality. So I think that
Like they have some sort of like extra sensory capability.
yeah,
beyond-
or like since if it's the idea that like we're making like this table only exists because we like just like perceive it and are kind of like making up like what it looks like, right? The fact that we all see it the same way, I think
sort of
kind of
refutes.
that fact that it's
Yeah, one can almost think about this in like purely scientific sense, and that the sun emits a certain degree of photons, and that those photons definitely do exist and are definitely interacting with the objects around us, even if we do not perceive, even if those photons do not actually enter our eyes and our lenses. So that could just be like a nice dismissal of this sort of phenomenalist argument, solipsist sort of perspective. But yeah.
So yeah, I do think it was interesting that you mentioned that how multiple frames of reference looking at like the same object, for example, can cause can kind of build a unified collective of reality. And I think there is, so one of the quotes on our book kind of relates to what you were saying, pretty like exactly, where it says the only invariant across all these cognitive frames of reference, like people observing the same phenomena, is that nothing exists by its own nature, independent if all means of detecting it or conceiving it. In other words, there's no way to separate the universe we know from the information we have about it. So, so I think that I think a lot of what we're trying to say as a whole is that consciousness and reality in what we consider reality are linked.
Yeah, but I guess again, consciousness is not totally exhaustive of reality. It does not totally constitute reality. Patrick mentioned this earlier about like a couple of days ago about whether or not we could categorize the early history of our universe, like the first couple million years of our universe as history, if there was nobody to chronicle it.
I was there, yeah.
You were there, you were in that. And when Patrick made that argument, I was very hostile towards it because it's I would presume highly egotistical and highly human-centric to simply define a universe in human-centric in human-based terms, right? I don't think we can do that. This would utterly preclude us from analyzing the infinite realm of stimuli that could exist.
It's interesting that I keep saying it's interesting that
It's intriguing.
It's intriguing that I know, Colin, you're a history minor.
Yeah.
And you have a lot of interest in history.
Yeah.
And the fundamental aspect of history is that human history is completely observed.
Yeah. Well, like
And-
history, like as a definition, kind of begins like with writing, right?
Yes.
Like the first written record is history. So like stuff exists before it. Like dinosaurs are obviously prehistoric, right? That doesn't mean they didn't exist, but it's just that no one was around to write about it, so it's not technically considered history, right? So I think if you go with a technical definition of history, then yeah, like the beginning of the universe, first billion years or whatever, is not history in that sense, just because of we don't have a written record of it from the time of it, right?
Mhm.
But it doesn't mean like dinosaurs existed, right? So it doesn't mean like it didn't happen, or we still can't or we can still study it and stuff.
But it is interesting that it is intriguing that
It's fascinating.
history is relegated to human history and has to be observed by a conscious observer that can be understood by other humans, whereas like origin of life research or dinosaurs or the early events of the universe are usually more related to scientific evidence and like physics.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I guess all of these sort of topics reduce down to the ultimate point that let's just take like the body of reality just as reality. Our conception of reality necessarily has to be human-centric. There is nothing outside of human-centric knowledge that exists,
Mhm.
right? Knowledge as we know it has to be related to human beings. So it would be quite arrogant to encapsulate the entirety of knowable knowledge. Actually, no, it would be arrogant to encapsulate the entirety of all possible knowledge into human knowledge. So we have to be, I guess, careful when trying to make broad general claims on what could be known and what is not known or what does not constitute knowledge. Yeah, that's
This got me kind of thinking about like an interesting, this is not really related to the topic, but it is tangentially related. But let's say we do discover an alien species that
Mhm.
is intelligent and we can communicate with,
Mhm.
that had seen the existence of the universe, and we kind of integrate with the society, right? Let's say they saw the very beginnings of the universe after the Big Bang, and like immediately like they saw like the Great Cooling, and I don't know if it's called the Great Cooling, but they saw like early expansion of the universe. Like what we usually relegate to physics, they saw in person. So if we do integrate with society, would that be considered history, or would we still have to consider that physics? We have
I think it would probably redefine history, like the whole meaning of another civilization. But I think that it can be both. Like I don't think like the like ice ages of like the Middle Ages, right? Those are uh like scientific phenomenon that happened, but are also recorded, right? So like you can tell that they happen in two ways. You can tell it through like the scientific point of view, and you can tell it because different historical records like wrote about an ice age happening, or unusually cold winters or colder temperatures, right? So I don't think that the fact that history and like physics overlap kind of make one or the other invalid. I think they can both be true. Like it can be both a historical topic and a physical like topic, right?
Yeah. Both can definitely be like reconcilable. I think this goes into the point about how knowledge is not just knowledge, but also lived knowledge. There's certain aspects of our knowledge that can only be derived from living through the actual experience. So if you have like this hypothetical alien species that existed at the start of the universe, they would necessarily be prone to observing a whole set of of different qualities that possibly could be incomprehensible to physics and only comprehensible and only be defined in terms of that alien species. Does that make sense?
yes.
Um,
That's kind of what we're heading towards.
yeah, but like there are certain qualia of the experience that are totally devoid of any physics related explanation. And then we would have to relegate that as knowledge. We don't have a choice in that matter. We have to consider that as knowledge. Would it possibly disrupt the entirety of human knowledge? Yes, I would think so. But that's not up to us to determine or reconcile with or even accept. It's just that would just have to be reality.
Yeah, the thing that I was trying to head for when talking about physics is that when I was talking about history and like reconciling history and physics, is that the main difference between history and physics is that physics is entirely based in mathematics, where mathematics is the literal like not personification, but literally the definition of like objective truth.
Yeah.
Mathematics is always going to be true. Whereas history, different people have different perspectives on the same event. So let's say that there are several civilizations that with their different abilities of conscious understanding, they are able to perceive the beginning of the universe in different ways, perhaps in ways that contradict our understanding of physics.
Yeah, I guess that it's kind of, yeah, what Eric was saying is based on like the senses, right? Because they might have different senses. So it's like hard to discount their historical record of it just because, yeah, like we just have to accept that as their version of events, right? Like it's kind of like, yeah, just in like base history, there could be two different versions of events, right? Like the Crusades, for example, right? Like the Muslim side and the Christian side, like there's two different stories of like what happened during the Crusades and stuff. So it's kind of hard to reconcile that as well, but it's not impossible. So like if you do collect all the different accounts of the beginning of the universe, you probably could figure out some sort of historical truth to it, but yeah, like since it's like such a complex topic with the different senses, it might be impossible. So like it will be a little bit more difficult than reconciling like differences in human history, right? But definitely not impossible based on like the different, it depends on what you get, right? Like from the different observations of the species.
The yeah, the reason why I'm bringing up this whole tirade, like relating history and like physics, is because I think it's important whenever we do talk about science and whenever we do talk about something, or whenever we do talk about something as objective as science, it is important to remember that this is our interpretation of events in history. Whenever you reconcile with historical documents, I'm sure both of you guys have done this a lot, you consider the viewpoints and the potential biases that can be implicitly stated in the author's work, right? If you read something from like I don't know, let's say if you read something from like a Nazi, for example, and you read something from another person during like World War II, right? You can see that they have very differing like perspectives on the same event. Or even like if you see like the American Revolution, like a Boston soldier and like an American like revolutionary have very different perspectives on the same event. One sees them as like triumphant, another one sees them as like rowdy or rebellious, right? So I think it's important to, from a higher level, it's important to consider how consciousness can impact our perception of reality. I don't know if you guys agree with this.
I would, I think, generally just say that subjectivity as a lived experience will never be an instrument to fully grasp truth, but it's definitely an instrument to approach truth in the sense that you will not have a a complete recollection of all factors that contributed to a certain behavior or decision or event. Um, this I guess this question of subjectivity that you're raising is ultimately highlighting that there are certain defects within our own rationality that possibly involuntarily preclude us from acquiring a pure truth. This applies to like history, this applies to any sort of like, this also probably applies to scientific development. But even, well, I guess I should just say this, by the very nature of by the very nature of us understanding reality via human perception, there will never be objective, fully objective interpretations of truth that are derived from our own conclusions. They all by nature imminently have to be flawed and subjective.
Like there is no objective account of history.
Yeah, humans can never have an objective account of anything.
Yes.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that because yeah, like with the different biases, it's like almost impossible to tell like what people actually said was true. So like the biggest help that like historians use is like archaeological evidence, where like they kind of see like, okay, the Romans did exist because you can see that like the cities there, they built the aqueducts, like you can kind of date it back to that time. So it does actually kind of use like physics and science to kind of verify historical records, and they kind of use that in conjunction with historical records to kind of verify, to get some sort of truth out of history, right? But I think in most cases where there's like all physical record is like gone and then there's only the historical record, then it is almost impossible to find an objective truth in history in that case.
All right. I think we did a pretty comprehensive cover. I mean, we did talk about like so what is just being portrayed here is like the multiple world or
Yeah.
many worlds interpretation of the universe, where let's say we did talk quite a bit about how the potential of consciousness influencing our perception of reality, or it obviously does impact our perception of reality, but it might also, based on the double slit experiment, just impact reality itself. So if going back to what we said in the last slide regarding like how there are quantum reductions in the microtubules in the brain. We can see that like quantum effects also do impact like it doesn't, there is evidence to suggest that quantum effects do show themselves in like the brain itself. So this is just kind of showing that perhaps there could be branching paths. If we are talking about free will, perhaps there can be branching paths that emerge whenever we make a decision. Or whenever like there's the presence of a certain a quantum particle or not.
Again, I would like to highlight that even that one can accept this sort of uncertainty and one can accept this sort of branching to exist, but one must still ask the question, what causes, or not even what causes, why does there exist an arbitrary, that's a horrible way to frame this the statement I'm trying to make. Why does the arbitrary consequence exist of us being particularly bound to this certain path within the sort of many worlds, or this particular branch within this many worlds theory? Again, this is an arbitrary decision, right? Or an arbitrary consequence that I don't think could be explained by the arbitrariness in quantum physics.
Yes.
Maybe it can, but as we currently understood it, or like how you described it to me, uncertainty and arbitrariness right now in the quantum sense is totally individualized to whatever particle you're talking about, not necessarily the sort of arbitrariness of our the totality of our own existence. That's a question that leaves me awake at night, just in a constant recursion of philosophical dread.
Well, quantum effects can also, they do manifest in the form of particles,
Totalities. Okay.
but they can also manifest in the form of totalities.
Okay.
It's just like there is the whole concept of quantum tunneling, where like in theory, entire suns, but planets can just disappear because of
Jesus
quantum tunneling.
Christ.
Yeah, have fun.
Quantum
Well, yeah, like,
tunneling.
wasn't that like the concept of like wormholes and stuff?
It's
right?
just
Or
that's bending like space-time.
okay.
This is like uncertainty.
This is
in the macro scale.
macro scale. This is like it can,
That's disgusting. That's a disgusting concept, and I hate it.
no, it's very unlikely. But like in theory, if time goes on infinitely,
Does
it's
the
gonna happen.
is the macro consequence just a cumulative effect of a bunch of micro particle consequences?
I think so, yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Well,
Well, in that
So
case,
it's so unlikely.
It's so unlikely because all the quantum
Okay.
particles in the universe, all of them have to disappear.
That's
in that
fine.
case, I
Yeah.
don't know if it's fair to characterize that as actual. No, it is fair to categorize it as a macro totality scale event. I would just say that there has to be. It's as if a totality, in my view, has to be a gestalt. And what I mean by gestalt is that there is a certain attribute of totality that is completely distinct and supplemental to the sum of the parts. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
In my view, that is a totality. Totality is not just a bunch of Lego blocks constructing a certain being. There has to be some sort of essence unique and attributed to totality as a concept.
It can be all the Lego blocks, though. It can be all the Lego blocks. All of them could just be gone. I mean, it's very, again, it's very, very unlikely, but everything is fundamentally composed.
But I'm saying that but there would maybe that sort of event alters the sort of gestalt essence I'm trying to allude to. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe gestalts as a interpretation of totality is just fundamentally incorrect. But that's what I would like to think totality should be defined as.
I think that we have nuclear war to worry about before the sun disappears.
Everything disappears, yeah.
But
Yeah, there's bigger problems at hand.
all right, so I forgot what we were talking about.
We can move on to the next slide. I
we can move on to the next slide.
Yeah, I think you're just describing that graph. And then
Yeah,
we kind of
Yeah,
got-
okay, so we did talk about this. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll move on to the next slide. All right, so now we will be talking Right. Now we'll be talking about understanding the mind, which is another big aspect of our course, and a lot of research that is being conducted today. So there's a lot of research being conducted into psychology and neurology and understanding the physical aspects as well as perhaps the metaphysical aspects of why humans are capable of consciousness on a level that other animals or other beings are not capable of. So I just want to start off with this question. Why is it so, if we are thinking through the perspective of a mind, why is it so hard to understand ourselves? We have a idea of things that are beyond our mind, and like we have an idea of like things that are in like celestial bodies, the movement of celestial bodies, or like the nature of like other biological like creatures and the origin of life and complex chemistry, but yet we struggle to interpret our own process, our own thinking process, and our own developmental consciousness. So why do you think it's so hard to understand ourselves?
Yeah, this is a very brutal irony in the sense that we are as people are the only beings who have access to our own minds, and yet we're so ill-equipped to actually like interpreting it. I would say that the difficulty in understanding our minds is ultimately just how do you approach this question? Predicated on just predicated on the fact that there are possibly, I think necessarily there has to be metaphysical, metaphysical aspects that are only sensed, possibly only sensed through an almost visceral process. This is why a lot of like these thinkers, I mentioned like Schopenhauer before this conversation, a lot of these thinkers have a heavy emphasis on aesthetics, on beauty, because it's almost as if beauty has a metaphysical quality that cannot be defined, right? And by understanding what we perceive as beautiful, we better understand our mind. You can't dictate these things, you can't quantify, you can express these in terms of language, but they are still nonetheless very relevant to how we operate as people. So I think, why is it hard to understand the mind? Maybe it's because we only have one instrument to do so, and we have to extend it to art a little bit. And maybe there's probably stuff beyond science and art that are needed in order to fully encapsulate the mind.
So do you think art is implicitly the understanding or the study of the mind?
I think one would have to say yes. Oh, again, it's not exhaustive and comprehensive, but it is a necessary component of the understanding.
That is really cool. All right. It's a very cool way to think about art. All right, Collin, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that this kind of maybe shows a little bit to me, like, or makes me think about how like consciousness might be just fully like outside of the brain, or not fully, but like in some ways outside of the brain, because there's certain like functions, right? Like as a person, like your brain knows where everything in your body is, right? But like because it has like the issue commands out of those areas, but you as a person, right? You as like the thinking like consciousness don't, right? Like you have to take an anatomy class, like figure out where your pancreas is or something, right? But your brain should already know this information. So that kind of makes me think about how like the brain and consciousness might not be as like either like linked or in tune with each other as like I previously thought, which is interesting. But yeah, it might be like it's in one part of if consciousness is in the brain, it might be in one part of the brain that like just doesn't receive signals from like another part, or I don't know exactly how it would work, but it is definitely very fascinating to think about.
I think it's interesting you brought up anatomy because I think it's interesting again every time. Right. But it is cool that you brought up anatomy because if you believe that the brain was created through natural selection through several billions of years of biology and natural selection and evolution, and I don't think that we ever had the evolutionary need. Medicine's a very recent development, and we've never had the evolutionary need to know where the pancreas is to know where like the heart is. The given in prehistoric man was that if you get like stabbed by like a goat, I'm sorry. If you get stabbed by an enemy,
What is the goat stabbing you with?
I meant like the rams. That's what I meant. Okay, we'll keep that in. If we get stabbed by look at mammoth, right? You're hunting mammoths, you get stabbed by a mammoth.
Yeah,
The given you die. You just get the infection, you die.
yeah.
If you're like in a pool, you drink dirty water, you get cholera and die. So we never really developed with the need to understand our own bodies.
Mhm.
I don't think we developed with the need to understand our own mind either. But I think that because there's no like psychological studies from like 150,000 BC, right? They didn't care. They just care like how do we optimize? They probably 10,000 BC is when agriculture was invented, right? So like they probably at then mostly cared about like like their brains were kind of wired towards knowing how to perform agriculture. But even then, like our brains, we still have to go to college to learn agriculture or like learn it from somebody else. We are not hardwired with the behavior of knowing how to like grow plants because agriculture is a very complex process. So I think that the reason why it's so hard to understand ourselves and the reason why it's so hard to understand like even anatomy is because we never grew up with the need to intuitively think of these things.
So perhaps because since we now have a practicable understanding of such devices of our mind and our body, would the necessary implication of your argument be that as we continue as a species, there would necessarily be a point in which this understanding would be refined and then would become relevant to how we exist?
I think it's difficult to say if we will ever have an evolutionary reason to understand our own minds. Perhaps in the future, there will be so many instances of violence that everyone will need to develop a skill in surgery, and this idea gets passed on generation by generation, such that the people who are hardwired to draw connections between anatomy and even like brain function are just more equipped to like are biologically more equipped to reproduce, if you know what I mean. Because ultimately, if you consider learning as the formations of synapses in the brain, it's ultimately a biological construct. So perhaps people that are more inclined to understand anatomy better in a future where there is a lot of violence
But
can.
Yeah, I don't think it will ever get to that point.
It won't ever get to that point.
Because, well, I just think that like stuff you learn does not get passed down as like passed down through generations. It's probably more like the proclivity to learn, right? Like the ability to be able to understand more complex ideas. I don't think anything like understanding of your own brain is going to be like a biological like imperative like that, or that will need to be understood like at any time. Like even like with agriculture, like you're saying, right? Like it's not like in 20,000 years from now, someone's gonna already know how to like farm, right? Like just right away, right? Like I don't think like those type of things are never gonna be fully needed for evolution. So it's just not going to ever develop into that. So I don't think we ever will develop into a.
But I think there is a point to be made where, I'm sorry, but I think there is a point to be made where a lot of animals who evolved by natural selection evolved because they learned a certain trait from their ancestor. That learned trait gets passed on to further generations. So what I'm saying here is that I don't think we will, I agree with you. I don't think we will ever get to the point where we are so desperate for the need to understand our own mind that that our mind is capable of removing its own cognitive bias from itself and like understanding itself.
Are you arguing that knowledge of ourselves possesses something unique compared to knowledge of anything else? Is that what you're saying? It could be true.
That could be true.
I might be inclined to agree with that, but it seems to me that is a conclusion that you are actually drawing upon.
hate to say it depends. Wait, hold on. Okay, so I think that it is. I'll say yeah, because it's not knowledge that is necessary for survival. But like you can say the same thing for like computer science. Um, so it's a tough spot to be in because I think that the reason why it's so hard to understand knowledge, in like understanding the mechanics of learning is because not learning, like the mechanics of consciousness is because it's impossible to remove consciousness from the consciousness perception of itself. I don't like it's like a recurrent process. And I want to like address this quote from Kant, who said, I'll just read this is from a book. Kant further argued that there could be no true science of the mind based on introspection, since the observed mental phenomena are altered and transformed by the very act of observation. So he said much more succinctly than what I can say. But yeah, you can't remove consciousness from itself when you're trying to understand consciousness, which is why I think it's so hard to understand the mind. Yeah, so anything to say?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so well, I'll kind of get into the next state or the next part of it, which is kind of delving into like how do we. So Eric earlier brought up the idea that there can be a super consciousness that is capable of going beyond what we normally consider consciousness, and then like understanding our mind from an objective perspective. Perhaps there can be a perspective that removes consciousness when understanding consciousness, which I know is kind of hard to imagine. But if we do see it that way, then we can see consciousness through an objective light. And if we can't do it that way, then we can make it into a science. You can make it more like scientifically tangible. I know some of you believe that it is scientific, but
one must ask the question about whether or not this super consciousness is an actual consciousness in the sense of would such an observational mechanism be derived from an entity that could have a conscience. This is a very this is highly hypothetical, right? I would think that even if so just I guess if we just were to completely proffer that there is some sort of entity, let's just call this entity like God, right?
Yeah.
That there is a God that fully and objectively understands all of the processes and motivations and influences that are occurring in my mind. I don't know if I would treat this a God as a consciousness as opposed to just a repository of information. To me, if this God can comprehend everything going on in my mind objectively, in addition to completing its own cognitive sort of exercises and activities, right? It would necessarily suffer from the same deficiency and faults that we would suffer from, in the sense that you cannot have a consciousness, super consciousness, or a consciousness inferior to our own that is in some way perfectly defined or perfectly formed. There has to be some sort of flaw. So I guess in that sense, sure, the super consciousness might be feasible, but ultimately you cannot treat this as an objective entity. I would, this gets really close to like relativism not in the moral sense, but in sort of like empirical sense. But like this is at least I think a necessary consequence for such a being.
we are kind of on the topic of ontological relativism. So if you want to talk about it, you can.
Okay.
But what do you think?
Sorry, what was the question again?
Okay, so we're talking about the existence of a potential super consciousness that can exist, that is capable of perhaps a higher, but first of all, okay, super consciousness implies that we can quantify consciousness. There is one
Yeah.
conscious level that is higher than another
Mm.
conscious level. What do you guys think of this? Is because I know we did discuss earlier about consciousness being a continuous scale. I know a lot of people colloquially say like I am on a higher level of consciousness now. But like,
Yeah, in the first picture, that guy definitely.
okay. But I know people colloquially say that, but do you is it is it like realistic to believe that consciousness is like can we quantify it and can we like declare something to be more conscious than another thing?
Yeah, I think you can. I think kind of like kind of going back to like other biological things, right? Like I feel like it's not absurd to say that like we're more conscious than like a squirrel or like a horsefly or something, right?
Mhm.
Like I feel like there is just a level, I think it goes back to like we were saying, like level of complexity that does attribute to it, maybe like sizes of like certain parts of the brain, right? Like be able to receive more stimuli, like more information, which kind of helps like form that consciousness. So I guess the super consciousness could exist in that case where like if it is omniscient, right? It is
Mhm.
receiving all of the stimuli like in the universe, right? So it will have a more refined and complex like system to be able to understand things.
When you think of that is interesting, but
It's fascinating.
that is fascinating. When you think of what makes humans different from other biological like, living beings, right? I think the biggest thing that people tend to ignore in the discussion of consciousness is our ability to communicate with language. I think that because there are theories in linguistics where the way you speak or like the language you grew up with or the language you know influence how you perceive reality. I think we saw the rival, but probably more yeah, Sapir-Whorf. So is that it?
I believe that's called the Sapir-Whorf
Sapir-Whorf.
hypothesis.
Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So and I know this was funny enough, this was brought up in another podcast I was watching, but there are like videos of and this is probably confirmation bias, but there are videos of dogs who use like buttons that are on the floor and they're able to like press those buttons to ask the human like what they want to do and like like if they want to go for a walk they press a button that says like walk and they're able to like communicate in that way, but the more buttons they do the more like access to communication they have in a way that's like more I don't know if it's more I don't understand dog but
Yeah.
it's
You should work on that.
I'm working today but it's in a way that's probably more capable than like barking.
Well, I think that's like more Pavlovian than like anything, right? Where they're like, they don't actually understand that like this means like like the person's gonna give me a thing. It's more like I press this, I get food, right?
Mhm.
I don't think it's as complex, but like other like species, like I think dolphins have and like whales have some sort of communication, right?
Mhm.
So like the question of like their consciousness.
Yeah, they have like
developed,
identity, they have names.
yeah, so that one is also very interesting because they also have similarly like, or even bigger size portions of like the brain that kind of are attributed to more of like our thought, right?
Mhm.
So that kind of lends more credence to the fact that like the brain is very important for consciousness.
I would like so this question of linguistic philosophy is like Bertrand Russell, Ludwig Wittgenstein are trying to answer this question. One can almost think about a super consciousness as not a consciousness that has a higher processing capacity that we have, but rather a consciousness that is able to translate its processing into terms of a language that is more sophisticated and more comprehensive than we have. In other sense, their access to language is more exhaustive of truth itself than what we have access to ourselves. I would like to think that, again, if we were to have access to this type of language, would we be able to adopt it? Possibly. Maybe it's beyond our biology to adopt anyways. But this type of consciousness that has a better format of language to use, I don't think it does not necessarily this does not necessarily mean that its understanding of truth is any more. What am I trying to say? It's although it might approach truth, it might better approach truth. It does not. It would still have its faults that are unique to its own type of consciousness that would detract from its own understanding of consciousness. That perhaps we might not have, that we might be able to correct, or maybe there are faults that we are unable and they are also unable to correct. But yeah, I guess like maybe consciousness shouldn't be thought of in terms of complexity or sophistication and processing capability, but rather just a means of communicating truth.
There is the whole theory of, not the theory, but there is the whole concept of a hive mind, where through kind of like communication, or not through, the hive mind is probably not the right word, but through communication, we're able to perform reasoning on a global scale. Even like, even beyond language, because there's translations, and all of us have like, within all languages, there's a similar idea for like a tree. There's probably a word for a tree, in every language, I'm willing to bet. So we just, because of language, we're able to communicate on a global scale. And that allows us to learn from different cultures and different people. I think we can integrate, as the human community, we can integrate all these like knowledge from different sources into kind of this collective consciousness in a way. So like the consciousness that we have now, that each one of individuals have now, is a result of our environment and the conscious, or in our perception of our environment. Right, things you learn from your parents, from your friends, from just observing other people, are interesting. It's intriguing to think about how much of our consciousness is just derived from other sources.
I
don't know if that is consciousness per se.
is a collective consciousness a unique consciousness in and of itself? I don't think I would say yes to that question. It would seem to be more of a network system than an entity that could be discretely categorized. But that is not to say that this sort of network is capable of deducing certain conclusions about truth that a disaggregated version of it would be unable to. It's just, I would think that consciousness has to have, again, about the concept of a gestalt, there has to be some sort of, I hate to use, there has to be some sort of je ne sais quoi about consciousness that is greater than the sum of its parts, which your conception of like a global communication scale does not possess. Yeah, that's.
Oh, what do you think?
Yeah, I kind of agree. Like, I think that there's more to consciousness than just a shared language, right? So, or like a shared understanding. And then like also like if there is like maybe not tree, for example, but if there's like a society who's like never seen like a dog, like does that mean they're like, and they don't have that specific word or understanding of a dog? Does that mean they're like outside of the collective consciousness of like humanity? So then it kind of like, for me at least, it kind of like falls apart in around like certain areas, like what constitutes the understanding of humanity? Like a majority of humanity, like understanding that creates the collective consciousness, or is it more of like kind of more of like an individual level? So that's why I kind of believe it's more on an individual level, because it falls apart if certain aspects of humanity or parts of humanity don't know or can't communicate certain ideas or things.
All right. So I do want to go back to so we did talk about the super consciousness for a bit. We did talk about how the underlying assumption in the existence of a super consciousness is that we have to quantify consciousness, and that fundamentally super consciousness are not impervious to faults. They are capable of making like wrong, like perceiving things wrong. Their perception of reality is not entirely comprehensive, but it is something that can perhaps be more informative than our our current perception of a reality. So I do want to talk about another thing that is more related to like Buddhism and meditation and how certain practices, even like things like ayahuasca and like recreational drugs, as some describe, can help attain these higher level of consciousness. So it says that in reference to meditation, Hidden Dimensions, which is the book we read, said that the empty space of the mind in which one is aware, once the mind has been settled in its natural state, is called the substrate. And it says, we'll talk about the substrate next, in the next slide, but the substrate is kind of in like, I know in ecology, the substrate is used to refer to like the bottommost, like as soon as the dead plant matter passes away, it just goes to the bottom and forms a substrate for new matter to grow. So the essence of meditation is that when you meditate, you remove all like external stimuli from your mind and the processing of that mind, and you remove all like internalized thoughts. And the point is you're kind of trying to reach a state where you are free from the noise happening in your mind. It's very hard to describe in like as someone who I don't really do a lot of meditation, at least not now, but it is kind of hard to describe because like people who do meditate and people who do practice Buddhism have their own language specific to meditation, which goes back to language, having like perhaps like having a higher state of consciousness that other people can't perceive. But I digress. When you what the book suggests is that from the substrate consciousness, we can see how other consciousness emerges over time. And in the substrate consciousness, we kind of have an objective view of the mind that we were talking about, the objective view that can help us gain more information about like conscious processes. So I'm thinking, do you think that meditation or any other methods can help us discover insights about the mind in a way that science perhaps cannot, or like traditional science perhaps cannot?
I would just treat like psychedelic drugs and meditation as simply they are not granting us access to a portion of our mind that is inaccessible. It is probably just facilitating, granting more efficiency to our already extant processes within the mind, such that we can probably derive conclusions that may have been difficult to achieve previously, but not totally inaccessible to us previously. I'm really, this might seem a little bit hypocritical because I was talking about like why I'm not an atheist earlier, but like I'm hesitant to treat these sort of activities as a means to transcend into some sort of higher consciousness. Rather, it's probably just granting or facilitating our presence.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. I don't think it like does like do anything to help like transcend the consciousness. I think it's probably more akin to like art in that way, where it's like kind of helps you like explain the mind, right? It can help see the mind in like a different way, like how like not everyone can like do art or like make something that kind of helps explain the mind. Not everyone can like meditate. So it's just another avenue that kind of helps explain the mind for like everybody, as it like helps either on a personal or more like global level, like understand how humans think and how they like behave and how the mind works.
What is the difference between explaining the mind and explaining consciousness? Is there a separation between the consciousness and the mind? I know it's
Yeah, that's the $1 million question right there.
that is, yeah. We can only theorize because we don't know.
Yeah.
If you're simply defining mind as like the sum of all psychological processes, then like yes, there's something different. I would tend to use those terms synonymously, but one could maybe treat the word mind as including both consciousness and perhaps any sort of processes that might exist beyond consciousness. But like again, that would that still constitute a mind if we literally do not have access to it? So I don't know. know if the distinction is too rigid in that sense.
Yeah, I kind of agree. Like you can't really separate the two. It's kind of more like the free will. I think like the concept of the mind kind of comes with consciousness because yeah, like consciousness or the mind doesn't really make sense without a conscious, right?
Mhm.
And then the conscious like kind of gives you a mind, right? So I feel like they kind of have to be attached in some way for them both like to work.
So when you said that consciousness is, or sorry, when you said that meditation is more akin to like, or meditation or like, recreational drugs, which I do
Yeah.
agree that I personally do not think that,
They help you reach a higher plane of existence or something.
yeah, I don't think drinking, I don't think that even meditation can do that in a way. I think that it can be very, there are probably several health benefits. It
Yeah.
could probably, improve mind efficiency, but in terms of actually studying the mind, I feel like that has to be done scientifically through a scientific method because it is difficult to quantify. I'm very much a numbers guy. But it is difficult to quantify like experience and subjective experience that you get from meditation. So I'm curious, is that what you both, I know you agree when, you seem to agree when Colin said that like meditation is kind of like art. So is that what you were, is that like referring to when you said like meditation is akin to art?
Yeah, sort of. That would make sense. Essentially defining processes and entities within the mind in a manner outside of language or outside of what we would typically use. One can treat it as like sort of maybe like a third method of interpreting consciousness aside from art and aside from language. So yeah.
Okay. It's a cool picture.
Yeah.
All right, last slide. We'll just go straight into this one. This is no cool pictures on this slide, sadly. All right, so objective consciousness in Buddhism. So we did kind of talk about this, so we probably wouldn't go too long into this.
Yeah.
But substrate consciousness allows us to understand how consciousness develops. This is just what's stated in the book. This is not my personal opinion, but substrate consciousness allows us to understand how consciousness develops by creating stem consciousness, which is like an analogous to stem cells, where you have a base consciousness that can kind of think of it as like think of consciousness as like a garden, right? You plant it like you have the base when you're born, you have the base as like your like smooth brain, your like your initial state brain, and then as you grow, you begin to form more of a consciousness from like external sources. It depends on how you interpret it. Actually, maybe that's a good way to start off. So, do you think that consciousness forms from experience, or are you kind of born with it? This is kind of delving into religion, but
you can start calling.
I kind of think that it definitely like grows. Like you might have a base consciousness like that. I don't really like know or have an opinion on like how complex it is, but I feel like your consciousness can get more complex with increasing number of like stimuli and information that it gets because then it has more. This kind of goes back to the more like computational element where it has more data to like use to make decisions, right? Because that's kind of like what humans do, right? They like take in data and information and then from there like make a decision. So I think that the more information, like as life goes on, and the more information you get, and the more ways you can receive information, definitely help make a consciousness more complex.
and you're talking about consciousness from the perspective that it is a metric for measuring complexity of systems, or are you just like making a comparison?
Well, I think the complexity of the system leads to a more or like a like kind of like with the super consciousness thing, like a higher level of consciousness, because with a more complex system, you have more avenues of receiving information and senses and stuff.
The conceptual analog to the question you asked would be sort of the debate between the linguistic debate between B.F. Skinner and Noam Chomsky, in which B.F. Skinner said that people learn language through impression from external stimuli, such that we're essentially tabula rasa and all of our language faculties are ingrained into us from experience. Whereas what Noam Chomsky said was, I think, is the common and now accepted understanding of language is that language is our capacity to learn language is a biological capacity that grows as we age. The analog would be like puberty. We are pre-programmed to experience puberty at a certain point in our life. And what Noam Chomsky says is that we are pre-programmed to possess and accumulate a sophistication in language processes as we grow up, necessarily because we have this genetic code in us. So I think consciousness can be treated in the same way as what Noam Chomsky said, and that we are naturally predisposed to sophisticate and complicate our own consciousness as we grow up. It's not something that we can escape, and it's something that has to occur even if we were walked into an isolation chamber away from everybody else. So in that sense, consciousness would be inherently an entity that solely depends upon our own existence and our own body and our own physicality, and could therefore possibly be, actually this goes about an earlier question, could possibly be isolated from everything else. So yeah.
Isolated from everything else in what sense?
Like sort of the disembodied brain sort of hypothetical that you had, that we could have a complete rational conscious inherent within our own genetic processes away from everything else in the world.
I wouldn't say that consciousness is linked with experience, because I mean it is, I think, from an intuitive standpoint. I mean, I think your explanation is more like philosophical, but from an intuitive standpoint, I think that I certainly am more, whatever consciousness means. We have like a rough idea of what is consciousness. We just don't have like a scientific definition. So using that rough idea, I think I am certainly more consciousness now than I was when I was like 2 months old.
Yeah.
And I kind of gained that from external stimuli, from like talking to my parents, from like taking in the news and the environment around
Or
me.
is it because your consciousness just naturally evolved as you aged,
That is also,
and that it was pre-programmed to do so?
wouldn't that negate the existence of free will, wouldn't it?
Not necessarily.
I don't think so necessarily. It would just be a sophistication of your capabilities, not necessarily. There would not be a necessary consequence of certain behavior that would result from this natural sophistication process.
So you're saying like our ability to break away from like the deterministic pipeline is to it increases over time as our consciousness grows in complexity.
I don't know if I completely understand the question
Like
of.
we are able to express more free will as we get older.
Oh, that's a very interesting. That is a fascinating question.
Okay, is there a limit? Because like I feel like I know like brain development, like pretty much your brain's fully developed at 25. So maybe that can be the point at which maybe that's the maximum, that until the end of your life, or maybe like until you're like before your brain starts to deteriorate.
Mhm.
Maybe that is when you could express the most free will. Because then
I might agree with that. Because like diseases like Alzheimer's, right,
yes,
are necessarily involuntary defects within your brain that compromise your own ability to process certain stimuli, retain certain stimuli. This is not the fault of the person, not within the control of the person. It just happens. So as we lose this grip within our own mind, as we become more prone to material biological degenerations and diseases, or in destruction, ultimately, our free will, I think, would necessarily have to also diminish.
right. That was heavy. But I have to agree, because you but if we are looking at it from that perspective, we can take the increase in brain development as being an analog for the complexity of the brain as a system. So in that sense, we can say that consciousness, if we choose to define it this way, or consciousness is, maybe even if we don't define it this way, consciousness is fundamentally linked to complexity.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's kind of like what I agree with.
Even if maybe it's not all complexity, maybe consciousness, there's a level of consciousness that is beyond our there's a level of consciousness that is, there's an aspect of consciousness that is beyond the realm of physicality, but consciousness can certainly be linked to like the complexity of a system, in our case being a brain.
Yeah, I think it is, yeah, just like fundamentally based in like the ability to intake as much like stimuli and information and like able to retain that information too.
Mhm.
So I think like kind of back to where we started as well with like artificial intelligence, I think the problem with that right now is that it's not even close to being capable to intake and process like the amount of information that like we do on like at like any given basis, right? We have like, we're always smelling something, we're always hearing something, we're always like feeling something on like many different parts of your body, right? So I think that level of stimuli constantly over the course of like years, right? Kind of helps build a more complex and more formed conscience than like any like AI that's been developed can.
The question of artificial intelligence in relation to human intelligence, I think is, I mean, what you say is true, but there you can build, fundamentally our nose just does like chemical sensing,
Yeah,
our taste just does chemical sensing, our hearing is just like vibrations in the air, which is all can be replicated through machinery. I think the more fundamental aspect of why ChatGPT is not like
person.
comparable to human intelligence is because fundamentally, even like large language models, neural networks, they all what come down to solving a mathematical equation. But whereas humans have the concept of understanding, which I think is understanding something is something that I think personally is an embodiment of consciousness, the ability to understand something. Um, so I think that it will be difficult to to like intuitively, or to build a machine that's capable of understanding and intuitively thinking on the same level as humans.
But how does one define understanding? Understanding in this sense will almost has to be, in order to prove that you understand something, you have to communicate it, right?
Yes.
And obviously ChatGPT does not have an ability to communicate outside of whatever text we type into it. So ultimately, if we don't give a sort of questionable being the access to a method of communication, we really cannot know whether it understands something or not. Even if we do give it access, it would be questionable whether there's like sort of like a willful engine behind the decisions that they're making. So this is a very important distinction that you brought up about AI and human intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, like back to like what's the definition of understanding? Because like I think if you like send a picture of like a table to like ChatGPT or like any AI, they'll be able to be like, that's a table, right? So like where does that constitute an understanding of a table, or does that not like they don't understand it, they're just pulling from information in their brain or in their like database?
Understanding is, well, it's a very interesting. I stopped using the word interesting. It's a very uh difficult to verbalize concept, because what you said, what ChatGPT does, or what like any convolutional neural network does, is that it uses math to identify shapes and colors
Yeah,
in a table, for instance, right, or in like any like animal, which I think is based on how biological
yeah.
creatures
So like isn't that like
classify
what we
images.
also do, right? So like where's the
That is what we do.
difference? Yeah.
But I think that when I say understanding, I think it's the ability to synthesize different sources of knowledge. For instance, it's kind of difficult to think of an example, but let's think of like ideation, right? Let's say I want to build like a device that can detect E. coli in the water. So then I have to like synthesize information of like biochemistry, information about like computer science, networking, like building networks, and all that kind of stuff in order to successfully do that. So I think that in the form of that kind of creative process of the creative processes like that involve a sort of understanding that machines are not capable of performing, at least in the current state. I don't know in the future, anything that happen in the future.
Yeah, I don't know if I like
even
agree
then-
completely, because like I think like the method of learning is like still the same. Like as at a young age, we're told like this is a table, right? It's kind of the same way as like teaching like an AI like ChatGPT. It's like you send it many pictures, like or a picture of a table, be like, this is a table, right? And then they can, and then they synthesize, like you send many pictures of different tables, right? Like you just portion those like images through, right? Like how they do like the capture things, where you have to like guess the images, like that's kind of like AI training in a way. So like they're kind of synthesizing the different ideas of a table. Like they've probably never seen this table before, but if you send this table to an AI, they're gonna be like, that's a table, like that's a bag of chips. Like even though they haven't seen that exact copy of a chip or bag of chips or table, which is kind of what humans already do, right? Because they go off of like I haven't seen that particular bag of chips before, but that is a bag of chips. So I don't get really the difference in thought process there, because it still kind of infers based on its database of knowledge, kind of how like we do.
But I think, sorry.
It's okay. I would also add that your example that you gave also provides a very distinct aspect of what we constitute as understanding, in that there has to be a prior motivation for the understanding to exist, such as if you were creating the software to detect E. coli in the water, there has to be some sort of prior motivation, a very difficult to define in tangible terms motivation that precedes this activity, such that your activity becomes justified, whereas an AI does not need such a justification to exist.
So you're saying like the justification of personal experience?
Or it's just like the AI doesn't have like a want to do something, right?
Exactly.
That kind of
It has no imperative to satisfy.
Mm.
It simply operates. This sort of aspect, I think, definitely must exist in a conscious being.
Yeah.
That this motivations ought to exist in a conscious being that currently we do not possess, that inorganic non-living beings currently do not possess.
Okay.
And
I
then-
think, yeah.
I think it's also interesting because they might never be able to reach a level of consciousness, because I think wants and needs for biological beings come from like biological imperatives, right? Like we need to eat and drink and stuff. So that kind of gives us the basis of that. While it's kind of hard to force an AI to want or need anything, that will kind of spur creative choices, right? It's like we wanted water or whatever. Now we have like back in like 10,000 BC, we wanted water. Now we have like water we can just get from the fridge and stuff. So it's like that kind of development based on our wants and needs, like biological wants and needs.
It's interesting. I'm now just thinking about how in a lot of science fiction, where robots and AI are perceived as evil, or like, not even evil, as even benevolent. When we consider AI, one of the first things that happen when the AI becomes sentient, like in the Terminator, right?
Mhm.
Or yeah, the Terminator. So, one of the first things that happen is that they get desire. I think that kind of shows that yeah, one of the first steps in sentience is desire.
It could be an independent desire.
Self-motivated desire.
Yeah, self-motivated desire. It could result from their material conditions, and that could be deterministic, or it could just spontaneously arrive.
Mhm.
But yes, it is this desire that ultimately propels consciousness as an entity. It is entirely integral.
All right. We did not discuss this part. We went off on a tangent. We'll quickly go over this, and then we should be done after this. But there are various ideas in modern physics that have suspicious parallels in Buddhism, such as the existence of discrete and quantum units of time. In Buddhism, there's a word for it, but in quantum physics is the Planck time. Atoms, there's also a fundamental, the existence of like fundamental like particles in Buddhism. Buddhism text describes fundamental particles, and the Big Bang and cyclic patterns. The Big Bang and the Big Crunch is the cyclic process of the universe where the Big Bang obviously happened, like not obviously, but the Big Bang happened like 14 billion years ago. At some point, there's going to be an event, perhaps quantum in nature, like quantum, what's the word? Quantum tunneling in nature, where like every particle just compresses into like one like singularity, and then it restarts. The Big Bang restarts again. So it's the cyclic nature of the universe, and these are kind of reflected in like Buddhist texts and Buddhist texts. So I'm interested. It's intriguing to think that when we talk about attaining these higher levels of consciousness and how that's related to having a perception of reality that is beyond our level of consciousness. And this is without them like studying quantum physics on their own time or physics on their own time. They know all this information just from like meditation. It's interesting. It's intriguing to see that they have this relatively in-depth understanding of the universe without any external stimuli and only from like practicing meditation.
Well, at least for the last point about the cyclic patterns in the universe, that the conclusion reached between Buddhists and physicists could essentially both be linked, not from some arcane insight by Buddhists, but just from the common human experience of birth and death that we all experience, and hence we try to extrapolate that process into physics or into religious doctrine. So at least in that respect, that could just be a human experience translated into other sort of processes. But yes, again, for the discrete units of time in atoms, that's I don't know how to explain how one could religiously derive what motivates one to religiously derive those kind of concepts. That's very intriguing.
From a skeptical viewpoint, the book did talk about this, but the book was kind of attempting to make a point about like how like meditation and like deep human thought can cause these kinds of revelations. So perhaps there's an element of confirmation bias where like something, maybe they read something about being something being elemental, and they thought that, oh, this is like an analog for atoms and like religious doctrine. But it's still just really interesting to stop saying interesting.
Run out of words.
It's just really it is kind of unexplainable that these two very specific ideas that are so fundamental to the universe have been, at least in some way, derived from like just meditation and deep thought. What do you think of this, Colin?
Well, I kind of agreed with Eric about how, yeah, like they're probably just like for the cyclical nature, they're just extrapolating like life and death, and just kind of like the cyclical nature of just like, yeah, just the human experience, like day and night. Like there's just so many like cycles that go on like in a human life, so they kind of just assume that the universe would do the same. Yeah, atoms are a little tougher to reconcile. But I don't know, like it can also just be more of like a, I don't know, like maybe more of like a luck thing where like a bunch of different religions and like beliefs of just different ways like the universe exists, or just fundamental parts of the universe, like, and they just happen to be right. Like imagine if we did like live on the back of like a turtle or whatever, and like, oh my god, like that religion was right, we are like on the back of a turtle. Like I don't think one necessarily proves the other, right? Like that it could have just so happened to be that like, yeah, we lived on like a turtle's back, or the earth is like on a turtle's back or whatever, compared to yeah, kind of just like, and then they could have been right about like, oh, they were theorizing about some like elemental particles, and then they were also just happened to be right.
Maybe there is an inexplicable human desire to subdivide everything you experience down to the most basic unit. What is the practicality of such a desire? I don't know, but this is very apropos to physics, and it could very well be a relevant sort of sentiment that precedes modern science and so forth.
Well, one of the Greek philosophers did propose the existence of atoms long before they were scientifically proven. I think
Yeah.
Democritus,
Someone.
Democritus, or I think it was Democritus.
Yeah, like some elementary particle or something.
Yeah,
right?
they said there is some fundamental building block of the universe,
Yeah.
which I think that don't see it. I'm thinking that it's cool
Yeah.
that it might be a result of like the human desire to explain everything and simplify everything, which can be the ultimate motivation of science as a whole, or our search for truth. But then you have to ask yourself, why do we want truth? Why can't we just live in ignorance of truth? Because ultimately there are a lot of like mathematical proofs and like and like scientific knowledge that we can just live without.
That's an excellent way to like wrap up the podcast. I would think that
We should do this more often.
I would think that our desire for truth is ultimately a means to which we want to reconcile our own existence, right? I would like to think that the more we understand why we exist, the more secure we are in our own existence. Yeah, this is very much ontological security. We want to be sure that what we are experiencing has some sort of justification, whether it's within our control or without our control. And in this way, we can, yeah, it's it's essentially not a matter of knowledge. It is the reduction in our own anxiety on why we have to live.
Is that why you think like it's a touchy subject saying religion is formed?
Yeah.
But is that why you think that beliefs came in like is that why you think like people started believing in religion and God?
Yeah, I think it's like the search for meaning, right? Can take many avenues, right? It could be religion, it could be science, it could be like explaining truths and stuff. I just think, yeah, there's just some inherent search for meaning that comes with like existence.
Is that to wrap up the final question, do you think the search for the meaning of life is something that is inherent in consciousness?
Yes.
I think at a certain complexity, yeah.
Maybe that is the one of the thresholds within consciousness. I would think that as when you ask these sort of existential questions, if you're capable of asking these existential questions, you necessarily have to provide some sort of solution to that. Because otherwise you are, it almost goes to like absurdism, right? That you're almost, even if you have free will, you're just like a piece of driftwood in the sea, and people that is not a secure sensation to feel. Because it is your life, you want some degree of just yeah, ultimately just security. We want some degree of security. I think that's all I have to say.
Oh, what do you think?
Yeah, it's like kind of what I was saying, like the search for meaning provides that like security, right? So it's kind of like the same like quest, right? Like the search for meaning kind of is the search for security, because with meaning you have security, you have purpose. So yeah.
All right, so there's a lot we covered in this
This 3 hour podcast.
nearly 3 hour podcast. I was expecting to make this like 45 minutes.
Would have been longer than 3 hours.
Probably, I think it's been like we started at
40.
8:40.
Oh,
Okay,
okay.
it's 2 hours.
240.
But it's still been a pretty long time. If you've made it this far, all three of you, thank you. All one of one of you. I'm the professor's gonna watch all this. I don't know if you did. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Skip to the end.
If you skipped the end. Well, yes, so
Or your future self, because you're gonna be watching this back.
that is true. Hey, Rohan. So yes, we discussed a lot about objective consciousness, the meaning, what defines consciousness maybe, and how can we consolidate reality and free will. And there will be a summary that sums up everything we talked about in this video, if I can find a way to do that in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
But thank you very much, and have a good day.
Night.
Night. Okay. Yep.
Time. Peace out. More about stuff.